give me a home where the buffalo roam and the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.
They say we can be defined by what we love, by what we admire, by what we strive for and focus on, and why. Today's guest, David McCullough, through his long line of work as an author, has defined himself then as a champion of history, and more so as a champion of humanity and of the human spirit.
Why should we limit our experience in life to the little bit of time allowed by our biological clocks? It's ridiculous.
The desire and capacity to improve the world through one's contribution, to stand up in the face of struggle and leading by selfless example, to saddle up, commit, and come out the other side having learned and represented something of importance, something bigger than you. This undercurrent, that of the human spirit overcoming great challenge for the betterment of the whole, pervades all of his writing, from stories of John Adams, Harry Truman, and the American Revolution, to the building of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Panama Canal, and the invention of human flight. One idea is always on display. Our potential is boundless, should we, in the name of worthy ideals, summon the courage to try and the fortitude to keep going.
One of the basic beliefs of those people, and they all say it one way or another, is to make yourself useful.
Having written 12 books,
it's hard work, but it's work I love.
David is quick to point out that his wife, Rosalie, is the reason it's all possible. He refers to her as the editor-in-chief who proofreads and reads aloud and improves draft after draft after draft of his writing.
So that he sits listening, find where he repeats the same word or where he's already said that before, and he can hear things that you don't see. And he feels it's a very good idea that everybody that writes should read what they write aloud, because it kind of knocks the boring out of it.
By some stroke of grace and luck, I am one of David and Rosalie's 19 grandchildren, a great privilege that allowed access to David and Rosalie, or Pop and Ro as our family knows them, in the tidy comfort of the home office where David writes and where he told me about his work, including his most recent book, The Pioneers, which hit shelves in the spring of 2019. What's it like to be the grandson of such a person, you might ask, as many have asked before. I will say that it is inspiring and it's fun, mostly because of his love for his craft and his verve for life, for culture and art and music and literature and humanity, conversation and learning and family. That was David singing at the very beginning of the episode, and you'll hear more throughout his renditions of some of his favorites. To witness him is a great gift, and I'm happy today to share this conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. Please enjoy some discussion and more singing with writer David McCullough.
Might want to close that door for your own sound protection. Not that I expect anything much, but you never know. We are sitting in the workspace that I've been fortunate enough to have created in Hingham, Massachusetts, and it's built by my son, Bill, who's a carpenter and builder, and all to my liking and all to my needs. Books in quantity and tables to spread things out on, my desk and lamp and books of the kind that I need for the book I'm writing. It's right on the desk. A turnstile type bookcase where I keep my reference books, the Dictionary of American Biography, other kinds of dictionaries and almanacs and catalogs and sources of various types that I've used over the years. And we're behind a house that was built in 1799 that we have restored to its original state with great care and according to the rules of the Historical Society of Hingham. Because we're in the historic district, you can't just do whatever you want. You have to maintain the character of the architecture of the whole community, not just your own house.
And it all takes place right here on the famous
Yes,
typewriter?
my typewriter, which a lot of people find amusing, peculiar, odd, eccentric. I bought it when I was embarking on my first book. It's exactly the kind of typewriter that everybody in publishing or journalism was issued back in the 1950s if you went to work for a newspaper or a magazine. And it's really what I learned to be a professional on. And I'd been using one just like it for about 6 years or more. But the only one I had at home to use was my college portable. So I bought this secondhand for $50 in 1965. And it was 25 years old at the time. And I have written everything I've written since on that typewriter, without exception, and there is nothing wrong with it. It must have 580,000 miles on it or more. And all I have had to do is change the ribbons.
Wow. So how many books have been written?
Well, the new one will be the 11th book. And, it'll be my 12th book. Many people say, don't you realize how much faster you could go if you worked on a computer? Of course I realize how much faster I could go. I don't want to go faster. I don't need to go faster. If anything, I need to go more slowly because I don't always think that fast. And I like the whole process of it. I can understand how that works. Whereas with a computer, I have no understanding of how that works at all. There's no fear that I'll press the wrong button and destroy 5 months of effort, as some of my friends have had the terrible misfortune of having happened to them. And for all I know, maybe it's writing the books. Why risk it?
You've mentioned before that you have all sorts of ideas, endless ideas for interesting stories and books. How do you ultimately make the decision to say, this is the thing I'm going to write about?
Well, I keep a running list, a kind of projected possible projects list. And I haven't looked at it lately, but I think the last time I looked, there were 29 ideas on it, all of which I think would make perfectly good books. But when it comes down to the deciding point, the decision is almost always visceral, from the gut. I just suddenly know that's it. That's what I want to do, and it can happen in various ways. When I wrote my first book about the Johnstown flood, and it had a very fine reception on publication, I was quickly besieged by 2 different publishers, one of whom wanted me to write a book on the Chicago fire, and the other one wanted me to do the San Francisco earthquake. So I was all of 32 or whatever I was, and I was already being typecast as Bad News McCullough. And I didn't want to do another disaster. I didn't want to do another chronicle of bad judgment, which is what caused the Johnstown disaster. Johnstown disaster was the worst disaster in our history, man-made disaster, up to and the equivalent of 9/11 in New York. Over 2,500 people died in it, and it need never have happened. And it was an illustration that to assume of the very realistic rule of life is very hazardous, perhaps even fatal, to assume that because can be very hazardous, that people in responsible jobs, they are therefore behaving responsibly. And there were too many people who were not behaving responsibly in the jobs they had, and thus it happened. But I wanted to do a book about something positive accomplished. I wanted to do a book about people taking on a worthy project with many reasons why they might not feel they could succeed, and even popular opinion professing that they could not possibly succeed, but who do succeed. I wanted to do a symbol of affirmation, and it took me one struggle of a time to come up with the idea, and it happened quite by chance when I was having lunch with two friends, one of whom was a science writer and the other whom was an engineer, architect. And they began talking about, we were down in the restaurant, the Lower East Side in New York, and not far from the Brooklyn Bridge, and they started talking about all the things that the people who built the Brooklyn Bridge didn't know about how difficult it would be when they launched into the project. And I knew right away, that's it. And I came out of that lunch, I had an appointment back at the office with somebody. I decided they can wait. I went straight to the New York Public Library. I went up those marble stairs to the third floor, I think three at a time, opened up the old card catalog file, and there were at least 50 cards of 50 different books they had on the subject of the Brooklyn Bridge, but not one of them described the book that I was already working out in my head on my way to the library. And very much like the engineers who built the bridge, I had very little foresight as to how many problems I was going to run into in writing the book. But once again, I had a huge stroke of luck of finding a treasure trove of material in a closet in the library at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute up in Troy, New York, where I spent a good part of the next 3 years going through all the material left from the Roebling family of what they had faced in the way of problems and what they accomplished. And I'm very proud of that book. I'm proud of all of them, but because when I was in school, I remember I was told by some well-meaning but I think misleading teachers that I was good in English and I was good in art, but stay away from math and physics and things like that because that was not my milieu. Well, I found out that if you had to understand why it happened, and you had to understand the physics and the engineering and structural engineering aspects of it, if you could find somebody who could put it in the English language for you, you could understand it. Nothing could be finer than to be in Carolina in the morning. Nothing could be sweeter than my sweetie when I meet her at the dawning. Where the morning glories twine around the door. Tell the sweetest story I want to hear once more. Pa-bum. Strolling with my girlie where the dew is pearly early in the morning. Butterflies all flutter up and kiss each little buttercup at dawn. If I had Aladdin's lamp for only a day, I'd make me a wish. And here's what I'd say, nothing could be finer than to be In Carolina in the morning.
Wow. That's really good.
Boy, I had a good smile coming back. I've never undertaken a subject for a book about which I knew very much. And if I talk about that with my academic friends, they find that very hard to accept. But if I knew all about the subject, I wouldn't want to write the book, because to me, writing the book is the means of discovery. It's the means of putting my foot on a continent I've never been to before, or getting tied up in a detective case. And I think also that I have the advantage of coming at the subject with a fresh eye. And so I look at things that others who might know a lot about the subject would just say, oh yeah, that's old Fred. But then I find out that old Fred is much more interesting than anybody realized, and his papers, which at the University of Cincinnati, are phenomenal. Very often it's in the secondary characters that you come upon the most revealing of personal revelations and letters and diaries. The chance to give credit where credit's due has been a very driving force for me, to bring people down front and center stage where the lights are for the first time. Because so many of these people who've accomplished worthy achievement or have seen us through extremely difficult times have not ever been given their due. And Harry Truman, which was the most ambitious of my undertakings, was certainly that way. There was no biography, birth to death biography of Harry Truman when I started out. John Adams. I felt these were two extraordinary men who were sort of bypassed because the focus was always either on Washington or Jefferson or Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower. And also, of course, in the case of my book on the Wright brothers, their sister Catherine was very instrumental in their success. I really don't think they would have succeeded without her. And Orville said as much himself in no uncertain terms. So that's a gratifying part of the work. We can never know enough about our past, our story, our history. And there's no reason in the world why it should ever be permitted to become dull, either on the printed page or in the classroom. And those are two, that's been a driving force for me for 50 years now in my work.
And a lot of what it seems like you're able to resurrect these characters is through the treasure trove, as you said, of journals and letters.
Yes.
And without that, you wouldn't be able to bring them to life in the way that you do, because you wouldn't be able to connect with them.
You can't. And the sad truth is that future historians are going to have a very difficult time writing about us, because we don't write letters. We don't keep diaries. Nobody in public life would dare keep a diary anymore because they can be subpoenaed and used against you in court. And alas, some of the young people coming out of college today can't write very well. Somebody told me recently that nearly half of all the law schools in the country now require their incoming freshmen, who are all college graduates, to take a basic writing course because they're incapable of writing a presentable letter or report or analysis of some sort. That's a sad commentary. Whereas you take a look at the letters written by Wilbur and Orville Wright, who never finished high school, they're superb. Their vocabulary is phenomenal. Their grammar, their capacity to express emotions and recall the visual context of events that they experienced, all as good as anybody could hope for. And they were incapable of writing a dull letter or a short one. So that collection, which is all at the Library of Congress, is phenomenal. The wonderful thing about working with letters is you're holding that piece of paper. It's just about the same distance from your eyes as they did when they wrote it or when they read it after writing it, or the recipient of the letter held it. So you're physically, in effect, putting yourself back in time in that relationship.
And what are you looking for within that letter? Because you can't include everything.
You're looking for the person who wrote it. You're looking for the character, the nature, and the mood, the quandaries, the worries. You're looking for humor. You're looking for melancholy. You're looking for who is this human being. And once you get to know the human being, then the whole story takes on a different quality, a different reality. History is human. History is about people. It's not about dates. It's not about memorizing statistics. It's not about boring. Now, some people can be boring, and we're boring, but that is seldom the point. Some people who may appear to be very fascinating and glamorous on stage, as it were, when you get them off stage, aren't very interesting at all. Whereas some of the others that you think, oh, I thought he was sort of not much, and then you realize he or she is immensely interesting, or learned, or not like the popular figure would lead you to believe. I'm back in the saddle again, back where a friend is a friend. Where the longhorn cattle roam, that's the place I call my home. Back in the saddle again.
The acoustics in here are great.
Riding the range once more. Toting my old 44. Ain't it wonderful what music can do to lighten the heart?
I want to go back to something you said a second ago about bringing certain characters center stage or out of the shadows. You wield great power as a historian, and you have to make choices yourself. But how do you slash away? I guess what is worthy of remembering? What are you trying to get to fundamentally about the human spirit?
Well, you don't know at the beginning. Friends will say, "What are you working on?" And I'll tell them, and they'll say, "Well, what's your theme?" And I make something up. I have no idea what my theme is. Maybe by the time I finish the book, I'll know. A lot of it has to do with handling of language, how you're putting it down on paper. When you first start out, you know far less than you will know toward the end. One of my books took 10 years. Truman took me 10 years. The man that I knew by the end of that 10 years was a very different fellow than the one I knew when I first got underway. But it can be the same even if it isn't 10 years, if it's 3 years or 2 years. And it begins to emerge. You begin to know people. It's as if you're moving in with a new roommate and you don't really know him or her. And you know what they look like, you know how tall they are, or what kind of a regional accent they might have when they open their mouths and so, but you don't really know them yet. And if you undertake a character as a subject for a biography, it's almost, for me, it's like getting to know a roommate. And they become the roommate, your roommate, literally. And you get to know them as well or better than you know people in real life because in real life you don't get to read other people's mail, and that's essential to it. Right. Or in some cases, you may interview them. You may get to know them, or you can interview people who knew them. Many of the time, people would say Harry Truman was nothing like what he is remembered to have been like. He was far more intelligent, far more better read, far more soft-spoken and considerate of other people's feelings and intelligence and so forth. Harry Truman seemed ordinary, seemed average. He was none of that. The common man. There is no common man. Nobody's common. And there's nobody who isn't somewhere down inside interesting and or who knows something you don't know. Never, ever misjudge somebody by how they're dressed or where they come from or how much education they've had or not had. It's in order to do this kind of work, you have to have immense curiosity. You have to be asking questions all the time about all kinds of things and asking people who might know a lot about the subject or something about some aspect of the subject that you know very little about, who can not only answer your question, but can give you directions on how to find the answer to your question.
What sorts of questions do you ask initially?
What was he like off stage? What made him angry? How did he spend his free time? What brought him pleasure? What was he trying to accomplish in his time? What was he afraid of? There's no end of questions. And one of the things that concerns me quite a lot about many students today, I lecture or teach part-time in schools and colleges all over the country. Well, I've lectured and taught at well over 100 colleges and universities. So I've seen changes come along over 50 years. And the one thing I notice today is they don't ask questions. And that's how you find out answers. They think they're obliged to only know the answer when the test comes, studying for the test, teaching for the test. And that's not how you should do it. I believe firmly that we need to bring what I incline to call the lab technique to the teaching of history, where you give a student a project to work on. You don't tell them much at all about what they're going to find or what they should find or what they should look for. Just give them the project and let them find out how to do it themselves. Because if they do that, they'll never forget it. Never. I could sit down and take a test on all of my books, and I'm sure do very well, even though some of them it's been many years since I wrote them. Because it stays with you.
The active participation.
Absolutely, and learning it yourself.
Right.
There's only one way to learn to play the piano, that's to play the piano. There's only one way to learn how to write a book, and that's to write a book.
Yeah.
And I don't think of myself as an historian. I think of myself as a writer who wants to write about real people and what really happened and why. And why? And to what extent was the narrative determined by the character of the protagonists? That things wouldn't have gone the way they did if different people had been cast in those roles, which is very often the case.
Right. And you say that you don't start out with a theme, but
No.
Looking at the body of your work,
Yes.
there are undeniable commonalities of theme, of individuals thrown into a seemingly insurmountable challenge, either by
Yes.
choice or by circumstance,
Yes.
and rising to the occasion, stepping up to the plate to do something larger than themselves.
Well, and I use a quote from George Washington where he says, "Perseverance and spirit have worked wonders in all ages." That's essentially what was characteristic of him, George Washington, and of his time, that they would not give up. And they had the spirit that gave them the resilience to withstand mistakes, defeat. How do people handle failure? Big point to take a look at. Do they lie there and whine and cry and blame other people? Or do they back up on their feet and keep going? Or they back up on their feet and quit? This isn't for me, I'm going home. And many do, and many do so understandably. But our country wouldn't exist if there hadn't been sufficient number who would not give up, who had every reason to think there was no chance of succeeding.
And why does that interest you? Why are those the stories that you want to tell?
Because I think they set an example for all of us. And I think we learn by examples, and they don't need to just be the examples of some wonderful friend or teacher or parent, or they can be the examples of so many that have gone before us. Why, I've said this so often that I'm sure I'm getting tiresome about it, but why should we limit our experience in life to the little bit of time allowed by our biological clocks?
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Right.
It would be as if you say, I'm only going to spend my time on this plot of ground here. I'm not going to go out and meet anybody else in the rest of the town, right, or find out who those people are buried over in the graveyard.
That's one of the things that I wanted to ask about is, you've said it before, that history is an enlargement of the experience of being alive,
yes,
just as much as
yes,
music or art. And I was hoping you expound on what that means.
Well, it helps you to keep your own importance and the importance of the time you're living in perspective. You walk into a great museum and you see a fantastic painting that was done hundreds of years ago. And you say to yourself, could anybody today do that? And that levels out your appreciation of others who've been down the same path and have excelled in ways that we would only wish we could do. Also, of course, those people who went before us made huge sacrifices from which we have benefited. They suffered years of struggle and pain, and many were killed or died in the process. And to be ignorant of that is clearly to be stupid, but it's also to be without gratitude. And that's an unattractive quality in a society, let alone an individual. We're not doing very well in teaching history to our children and grandchildren. And there's a lot of concern about it, as there should be a lot of concern about it. The vocabulary of students today is way down from what it was 20 years ago. And you say, well, what difference does that make? Well, I'll tell you what difference it makes. We think with words. And if we have fewer words to think with, maybe we're not able to think quite as well as we should.
Yeah.
And life requires a lot of thinking. I'm often asked, how much of my time do I spend reading or doing research, and how much of my time do I spend writing? Nobody ever says how much of your time you spend thinking. And that's a big part of it. One of my favorite moments in doing the research on John Adams was when I, working with his diary, one of his diaries at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I came upon an entry for one day which said, "At home thinking."
For the whole day.
And then I saw it 2 or 3 times later on. But imagine if some of the people who were representing us in Washington could be able to say that, at home thinking.
So when you're not writing, are you thinking about it? Do you ever turn it off?
I turn it off a lot. I don't I can't read much beyond the reading I have to do in order to keep up with what I need to know.
And what does that consist of? What your subjects were reading?
Yes, I do believe it. You should not only read what they wrote, but you should read what they read, and what they took inspiration from, which is very apparent in the 18th century figures that I've worked with. But you should also go where they went. You should smell the night air in Coal Town or wherever it is. You should walk the walk. And sometimes that's not going to be easy because it was in the midst of a blizzard or something. You should do that if possible. And you should study photography, photographs taken, particularly, obviously, if you're past the 18th century and photography is entered in. Theodore Roosevelt was the most photographed president ever up until then, because that's when photography came in. And as a consequence, he took every advantage of having himself photographed, and the press adored photographing him. As a consequence, we can see him, we can evaluate the accuracy of his claims by something in a photograph. The photographs, photographing portraits in the 19th century are misleading in some ways because you had to sit very straight and still to have your photograph taken. So very few of those important people are ever smiling because they didn't smile. They sometimes even had a rod thing in their back so they would sit absolutely without moving. And they weren't that way at all. They were just as full of mirth and joy of life and song and dance as any of us are. Just as the Puritans weren't the way we picture them. They weren't all dressed in black and with gloomy faces and gloomy outlooks. They liked to have parties and festivals and wear colorful clothes and have a drink.
Speaking of that, you write about not just politics and economics, but about the music and the importance of literature and poetry. Can you talk more about why those things are important?
Well, this is a story I like to tell, and it was a wonderful, revelatory moment. But I was driving down Massachusetts Avenue one morning in Washington on my way to an appointment, and I came to Sheridan Circle, which is the Embassy Row there, and there was a huge traffic jam, and everything had stopped. And I was looking into the square there, the circle, and there was old General Sheridan up on his high horse with a requisite pigeon on his hat. And I thought to myself, I wonder how many people that drive around this circle every day, twice a day, have any idea who that is. Probably very few, or why he's there. And I was feeling rather down about that and frustrated, mad that I was stuck in the traffic and I was late for my appointment. And all of a sudden, I had the car radio on. All of a sudden, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue came on my radio. And that just lifted me right out of my car, out of my doldrums. And I thought, who's more important to our story as a country and a people? Phil Sheridan or George Gershwin? Well, the answer, of course, is they're both important. But you should not leave Gershwin out, the Gershwins of our time. Our painters, our writers, our musicians, our composers, our poets, our playwrights, architects, all shaped their time and consequently those of us who follow in our time. Just as the paintings on a cave wall have told us more than we ever knew about anything else, much of the human story of those people. And it's very often the works of art that last the longest. Kennedy said it in one of his speeches. Let me find it and just read. He said it beautifully, as he said so much.
David's looking through his book, The American Spirit, a collection of his speeches, to find a JFK quote, and we reference that book for a bit here.
Now imagine a president of the United States today delivering this speech. It's on page 152. I look forward to an America which will reward achievement in the arts as we reward achievement in business or statecraft. I look forward to an America which commands respect throughout the world, not only for its strength, but for its civilization. This country cannot afford to be materially rich and spiritually poor. Art is the great unifying and humanizing experience. The life of the arts, far from being an interruption, a distraction in the life of a nation, is very close to the center of a nation's purpose and is the test of the quality of a nation's civilization. I am certain that after the dust of centuries has passed over our cities, we too will be remembered, not for our victories or defeats in battle or in politics, but for our contributions to the human spirit. There it is, right there. And it's as true, obviously, today as it was in his time, maybe more so. But to have leadership which understands that is to be blessed in more ways than most of us fully appreciate.
Because what happens to a society that neglects these things?
Well, it becomes wrapped up in material pleasures and material acquisition and the nonsense of ego and self-centered narrow outlooks on life. I think that the role of art, and I include language in that, is essential to a civilized society. Now you notice what he uses the word purpose in there. He talks about national purpose, and that's a very powerful word. The Wright brothers were raised by their father, who was a Protestant minister, to have purpose in life. That the good life was life with purpose.
The tenacity of purpose.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite.
And if a student were to come out of college today, knowing how to use the English language on paper and on his or her feet, and have an admirable purpose to pursue, they would be far more guaranteed to have a decent and productive and useful life than if they come out with a degree in civil engineering or whatever. Just that. So many of the students today, with the encouragement of their parents, which is understandable given the tremendous cost of higher education, that they have to take a subject, have a major which will guarantee the best possible salary in a job after college. Don't do it that way. If you come out knowing how to use the English language, you're going to be 20 yards or 20 miles ahead of anybody else who doesn't know how to do that.
One of my favorite parts is this quote. Maybe if we could put presidential power in a pot and boil it all down, a big part of what we would find at the bottom would be language, the use of language, the potency of words. Power to persuade is power indeed, and only a relative few of the presidents had it. And then you mentioned a few. Lincoln, TR, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, JFK.
And I would add Barack Obama. He has it, absolutely has it.
And you say eventually that language has this isn't a quote, but the language transcends time.
It does.
And
it will carry on endlessly, as it should, as long as there's a language. give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in, let me ride through the wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in, let me be by myself in the evening breeze. Listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me off forever, but I ask you, please, don't fence me in. I think also that it's very important for young people to understand that the most effective, admirable presidents we've ever had have all been students of history. Now, one of the essential truths that we Americans ought to get clear in our heads is that exceptional presidents are the exception. They don't come along all the time. And to think that they do is naive, childlike, ignorant of the reality of life. And but the best of them have all been lifelong students of history. Harry Truman, who never went to college, never stopped reading history. He liked to say the only new thing in the world is the history you don't know, which is a very wise observation. It's true. And yet we don't require history as we should. 80% of the universities and colleges in the country now no longer require any history in order to graduate. Mistake.
Because without knowing the history, as you mention in this essay here, is that if you don't know what you've inherited, then you won't value it, and you make the comparison to a piece of art. You say if you don't care about it, if you've inherited some great work of art that is worth a fortune, and you don't know that it's worth a fortune, you don't even know that it's a great work of art, and you're not interested in it, you're going to lose it.
That's right.
And that was one of the strongest comparisons I found in this.
Well, thank you. I feel that very strongly, and it also can be seen as a form of creeping amnesia, national amnesia, where we just don't remember any of that. Oh yes, George Washington. Now, what did he do? Abraham Lincoln. Does he have a beard? I had a student come up to me at a Midwestern college. She was a bright sophomore, very enthusiastic, and thanked me for coming to the campus. She said, because until I heard your talk this morning, I never realized that the original 13 colonies were all on the East Coast. And I thought, how can this be? She's in her sophomore year in college, and she doesn't know that. We knew that in grade school. Because we had to take history in grade school. And we had to take art and music and theater. And we had to stand up and give a speech. And we had to write papers in grade school. You can't start too early. I think the fact that where I would put, if I could have the power to where to put the emphasis, it would be on grade school. Because if you can get them interested, then it'll stay for life.
And what about you? What was your childhood like? Were you introduced to history early on by your parents, or? Yes,
a lot of it was what I overheard at the dinner table every night, and it fascinated me. And we had a lot of history in school, and particularly very good at high school history course. I was very fortunate. I went to excellent schools my whole career through, all the way through college, with wonderful teachers who changed my life, many of them.
What did they do? What did they bring out of you?
They told stories superbly, and that's what history is, it's a series of stories. Or they opened my eyes to look at and observe in a way I never had before. In good part because I was very interested in art and drawing and painting. and I still am. And I took every course I could all the way through in drawing and painting, and I encourage anyone who wants to become a writer, who's serious about becoming a writer, to go take a course in drawing or painting or both, because it teaches you to see in a way that nothing else will. Dickens said, "Make me see," and that's it.
Did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I wanted to be a lot of things. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to be a leader of some kind. And one thing led to another. In college, I did the very nerd-like thing of staying on campus over spring vacation to do work on a thesis for my junior year. I was writing a paper on the African-American writer Richard Wright, and his papers, I was at Yale, and his papers are in the library there. And everybody had gone off somewhere to some island in the Caribbean or back home to Cincinnati or whatever. And I had the place to myself. And I had the librarians at my beck and call to help me. And I had this fantastic collection to work with. And I thought, I really like this. It was really the best spring vacation I ever had. And I thought, maybe there's something in this kind of work. It would take me a while to figure that out, but it was a wonderful experience. And again, I was digging into the real thing, not something that some scholar had written about Richard Wright, but what he was saying about himself and his work and his life.
And then when you took the ultimate leap to the risk, really, to become a writer full-time, could you talk about that a little bit?
It wasn't really a leap, because if you were in the 1950s, the newspapers, magazines, advertising agencies, radio stations, television stations were booming, new ventures of all kinds. And if you were an English major at a place like Yale and maybe worked on the college newspaper or the yearbook or whatever, you could go down. It was as if you went to a trade school. You could go down to New York and get a job like that. Much faster than you could find up an apartment. I got my job in probably 3 days, if that, at time in life. And they were hungry for good people to come in and learn the trade and help build it up.
Yeah.
And I worked with marvelous people for 6 years. And then Kennedy came along, running for president, and called on us to do something for our country. And I took that beckoning, that call, entirely to heart. I quit my job and went down to Washington, not knowing anybody in the Kennedy crowd or anybody in government. Went door to door, literally, applying for a position where my education and my professional experience would be appropriate, and wound up, a great stroke of luck, in a job wherein I was way over my head, at the U.S. Information Agency, which is a government organization that doesn't exist anymore. It was marvelous. It ran public libraries all over the world and published various kinds of books and magazines. And I was put in charge of a magazine published for the Arab world. And it was, we wrote it and laid it out and everything in English, and then it was translated into Arabic and printed in Beirut and sold on the newsstands throughout all of the Arab world. So I had to learn an awful lot about the Arabs and the Arab world overnight, and I did it. In many ways, it was the most difficult roadblock in my life, and in other ways, it was the opening up of a whole road that would lead on to wonderful opportunities I had never imagined up until then.
And a lot of what you write about are people who, and you say this in this book too, in The American Spirit, that nobody ever knew how it was going to turn out.
No.
And neither did you when you became a writer.
None of us do.
Right.
We don't know what we may be called on, but for some personal thing that happens, some professional challenge or opportunity. And you of your generation know so much more than we ever knew about so much that we didn't even imagine would ever exist. And I'm in awe of that, and of how much you know, and how many things you know how to use that are beyond me. But I think we always have to come back to the fundamentals of learning and the essential need for learning to achieve a life of value. And they said it in the founding time over and over again, and with not just eloquence, but with fervent conviction. Any nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. Jefferson. When in the course of human events, the operative word there is human. You have to understand the human situation, the human nature. We pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. Well, what do they mean by sacred honor? We should know that. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. What did they mean by happiness? They didn't mean material acquisition and more comfortable chairs and longer vacations. They didn't mean that. They meant quality of life, quality of achievement, and the lift that learning brings in the accompaniment of happiness.
And the obligation, the responsibility to learn and to know about your
and to
world.
improve the life of fellow human beings, if possible, in the time that you have here on Earth.
Is that part of what drives you to do the work that you do?
Absolutely.
The contribution that you're making.
Absolutely. And I don't like to sound self-promoting or self-congratulating, but I really feel I've been doing something for my country my whole working life. And will continue to do so as long as I can, because I love it. I don't do much in the way of playing golf, or as you know, or flying off to some enchanted island. I get my kick out of coming to work every day. I'd much rather do that than anything else.
Do you know what you're going to write about every day? What's the process like? You come out?
Yes, I do. I try to finish each day knowing where I'm going to pick up the next day.
So you make a note?
No, I just sort of know. Once it gets rolling. And there's a lot of rewriting, writing and rewriting.
So you wake up, you're excited, you know exactly what you're going to write about. You walk out here.
No. I got to get the old typewriter under my hand and feel the vibrations coming out of it. And rewriting is essential. That's one thing young people don't understand. I try to write for the ear as well as the eye. And so Roe reads everything aloud that I write, and I hear it. Because you can hear when you're using the same word too often, and you certainly can hear when you're being boring.
And that's what you're listening for?
Yes. You can write it better than that, McCullough, and then you do. Let me be by myself in the evening breeze. Listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me off forever, but I ask you, please, don't fence me in, just turn me loose. Let me straddle my old saddle underneath the western sky. On my cayuse, let me wander over yonder till I see the mountains rise. I want to ride to the ridge where the west commences, gaze up at the moon until I lose my senses, 'cause I can't look at hobbles And I can't stand fences, don't fence me in. Papa, don't you fence me in.
Beautiful. Thanks, Bob.
How would you describe the Pioneers?
The Pioneers is a venture of a kind that I've long hoped I might be able to attempt, in that it's about people you've never heard of. And I've always wanted to do that, but never expected to be able to find a subject for which there was sufficient original material, meaning diaries, letters, unpublished memoirs, and the like. And through pure chance, I came upon a collection in Ohio, at Marietta, Ohio, at Marietta College. And it was like nothing I ever even imagined in terms of both the quality and quantity of the material, letters and diaries and so forth, numbering in the thousands, but also, importantly, about people who in many ways represented the best that's in us as a people, in that they set out from New England, mainly around Boston, to establish what was then the first permanent colony or settlement in what was then known as the Northwest Territory. And that meant it was north and west of the Ohio River, which would ultimately become 5 states, 5 major states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which was a territory as large as the original 13 colonies were. And they were added on to the 13 colonies as part of the United States because of the settlement, the peace treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. And these very brave people went there with the noble ambition to establish a part of the United States wherein the statement, all men are created equal, would in fact be true, because there were slaves in every one of the original 13 colonies. So as part of the Northwest Ordinance, it was proclaimed as law, passed by the Congress before we had a constitution. It was in the summer of 1787 that there would be no slavery. It was also part of the original document that there would be free public education for everybody, from grade school through college. And they achieved that, too. It also specified that the Native Americans, Indians, or Native Americans as they are now more commonly known, would be treated with fairness and honesty and respect. It turned out not to be possible for them to determine living up to that last creed. But they did establish no slavery. They did establish public education all the way through. And it was one of the major achievements in our history for which the people that made it happen have never been given the credit that they so deserve.
Until now.
Until now.
Yeah.
And so that was thrilling in itself to be able to do that, to bring that
Sure.
on stage, downstage, in full light. And they are as interesting and admirable as almost anybody I've ever had the rare privilege to write about.
Yeah.
And they express their worries and their fears and their pain and their refusal to give up in the face of adversity of a kind we don't ever know anything about.
Yeah.
And compared to those people, we're all a bunch of softies.
Yeah.
No, truly we are.
Yeah.
And And we need, I think two of the most important qualities that a knowledge of history so emphasizes are, one, that we have to develop empathy as human beings, be able to put ourselves in the other person's place. And that includes people who went before us that we don't know. Think what they went through. Think what they didn't know about how things were going to turn out. And the other one is gratitude.
Yeah.
Gratitude for what they did. We walk around thinking we just deserve all of it we have. And not know about all that, to not care about knowing all about it, is not only rank indifference of an ugly kind or stupidity, but it's an expression of gross ingratitude.
Yeah.
So I feel as proud and grateful that I had the chance to write this book as any book I've written.
I can only imagine. And it's a wonderful book. And you touched on some of it there, but I would like to hear your thoughts on this. The subtitle, The American Ideal, Those Who Brought the American Ideal West. How would you describe what that is? What is the American Ideal in this case?
Well, that we don't just speak noble thoughts and do nothing about it, that we're not gross hypocrites, and that fairness and openness to all peoples. We have this ugly issue about immigrants today. We're all immigrants. We all were immigrants
right.
at one point, including the Native Americans. They came here from somewhere else.
Right.
And there's a line in one of the popular songs, fame, if you can win it, comes and goes in a minute. It's not good enough just to be famous for the moment. And it's, in my view, essential to achieve the good life is to have a life that has purpose, an admirable purpose. And these people, if anybody ever had noble, admirable, consequential ambitions, they did. Mm-hmm. And they did not give up. That's so important to know.
Yeah.
They didn't fling themselves down on the ground and whimper and whine, feel overwhelming self-pity, giving all kinds of excuses of why they didn't achieve what they set out to do. And they've faced adversities of a kind they never expected because they'd never had any such experience. And they weren't softies. They were mainly people who left New England farms. They knew what hard work was about. They knew what adversities and painful disease, and imagine there's no anesthetics then.
Right.
None. Whether you're having a tooth pulled out or giving birth to a child. Mm-hmm. The storms and winters and the spread of disease, epidemic disease, all of a kind that we're not used to, thank goodness.
Right. And you've written a lot in Pioneers and across the board with your other books about people with a sense of spirit, courage. Mm-hmm. How do you think about that word, courage? What does it mean to be courageous from the perspective of those you've written about?
Well, it's courage that comes from the meaning of what it is they're trying to achieve. Courage that comes from how they were brought up, that you don't lie, that you don't cheat, that you're not unkind to people, that you're not self-centered and selfish and self-adoring. And you're working in the spirit of community. Very, very important. And the idea that almost nothing is ever accomplished alone. It's a joint effort. Has to be a joint effort. So you have to work together, and you have to know how to do that. Mm-hmm. And the gift of leadership, which doesn't come to everybody, and to have so many remarkable leaders, not only as part of this story, but to come out of that place that they created, like Abraham Lincoln,
Yeah.
for example, or any number of others that we think, oh, how American they were. And they were American, but they were also from that part of America.
Right. And perhaps this falls right into that, but the premise of patriotism.
Yes.
What does it mean to be a patriot today?
Well, it means more than just wearing a little flag on your lapel, and it means more than bragging about your wealth or your fame or whatever. It means giving unto the cause of that this country stands for, not just here, but all over the world, giving to that what you can. One of the tenets, basic beliefs of those people, and they all say it one way or another, is to make yourself useful. Make yourself useful for the betterment of the community, betterment of the cause, betterment of the nation, and live up to the ideals that you were handed by your predecessors.
Right. Something bigger than yourself.
Yeah, strength of character.
Yes.
That's what matters most.
Yep.
When John Adams, who was the first president to occupy the White House, spent his first night there, Abigail, his wife, was not with him. But he wrote her a letter that night from the White House, first letter ever written by a president from the White House, in which he said, "May none but honest and wise men ever live under this roof." And what I like so much about that statement is he puts honest first.
Yeah.
And Franklin Roosevelt had that carved into the mantelpiece of the White House, East Room. And then when Truman came along, the White House had to be rebuilt. In fact, certainly the entire interior was rebuilt. He made sure it was carved into the stone of the fireplace in the East Room, not just the wood, as Roosevelt had it. And then when Kennedy came along, Jackie, his wife, made sure that the words were legible in that stone. And I think it's just as an example of the lessons to be learned by admirable predecessors.
Absolutely. And speaking of Adams, another one that stands out from your book on John Adams is his favorite play, Cato, and the line, "We can't guarantee success, but we can deserve it."
Yes.
And that's one that I think of often,
Yes.
because it applies to anything you're trying to accomplish.
Exactly.
It depends on how you carry yourself, the work you put in, the character you bring to the table.
The happiest people I've ever known are people who had a work that they wanted to do, which they felt would make the world a little better because they made the effort.
Yeah. Amen. Thanks for letting us barge in on you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam and the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. That was a good one. Well, we made history today, Todd.
Recorded some songs.
Just recorded an album instead of an interview.
Oh,
Thanks everyone for tuning in. That's it for this episode. That was David McCullough. This is Ty, your host. Thank you for listening. Thanks also to Rosalie Rowe, my grandmother, for being on that episode, and my uncle David Jr. was on that episode a bit too in the background, as was Aaron Mason, Thank you to Aaron for the sound design, Elon Watkins for the artwork and the backup vocals and guitar on the music you just heard. Also, thank you to Super Yamba Band for letting us use the music on this episode. Thanks again for everyone tuning in. Feel free to give us a rating, commentary if you feel so inclined on iTunes. We'll connect again with you soon on the Jalapeno Podcast. Take care. On we go.